For the rest of the two crafts passes over the near side of the Moon, Mattingly prepared to shift Casper to a higher, near-circular orbit, while Young and Duke prepared Orion for the descent to the lunar surface. According to mission rules, under such circumstances, Orion was to re-dock with Casper, in case Mission Control decided to abort the landing and use the lunar module's engines for the return trip to Earth. After several hours of analysis, mission controllers determined that the malfunction could be worked around, and Young and Duke could proceed with the landing. Powered descent to the lunar surface began about 6 hours behind schedule. Because of the delay, Young and Duke began their descent to the surface at an altitude higher than that of any previous mission, at 20.1 kilometers. After descending to an altitude of about 13,000 feet, Young was able to view the landing site in its entirety. The LM landed 890 feet north and 200 feet west of the planned landing site at 104 hours, 29 minutes, and 35 seconds into the mission, at 2 hours 23 minutes and 35 seconds Coordinated Universal Time on April 21st. The availability of the lunar roving vehicle rendered their distance from the targeted point trivial. Young and Duke began powering down some of the LM's systems to conserve battery power. Upon completing their initial procedures, the pair configured Orion for their 3-day stay on the lunar surface, removed their spacesuits and took initial geological observations of the immediate landing site. The landing delay caused by the malfunction in the CSM's main engine necessitated significant modifications to the mission schedule. Apollo-16 would spend one less day in lunar orbit after surface exploration had been completed to afford the crew ample margins in the event of further problems. In order to improve Young's and Duke's sleep schedule, the third and final moonwalk of the mission was trimmed from 7 hours to 5. First moonwalk. After waking up on April 21st, Young and Duke ate breakfast and began preparations for the first extravehicular activity, or moonwalk. After the pair donned and pressurized their spacesuits and depressurized the lunar module cabin, Young climbed out onto the porch of the LM, a small platform above the ladder. Duke handed Young a jettison bag full of trash to dispose of on the surface. Young then lowered the equipment transfer bag, containing equipment for use during the EVA, to the surface. Young descended the ladder and, upon setting foot on the lunar surface, became the 9th human to walk on the Moon. Upon stepping onto the surface, Young expressed his sentiments about being there. "There you are, mysterious and unknown Descartes. Highland Plains. Apollo-16 is gonna change your image. I'm sure glad they got old Brer Rabbit, here, back in the briar patch where he belongs." Duke soon descended the ladder and joined Young on the surface, becoming the 10th person to walk on the Moon. Duke was then aged 36. No younger human has ever walked on the lunar surface. Duke expressed his excitement, stating to Capcom Anthony England, "Fantastic. Oh, that first foot on the lunar surface is super, Tony." The pair's first task of the moonwalk was to offload the lunar roving vehicle, the far ultraviolet camera, spectrograph, and other equipment. On first driving the lunar rover, Young discovered that the rear steering was not working. He alerted Mission Control to the problem before setting up the television camera, after which Duke erected the United States flag. During lunar surface operations, Commander Young always drove the rover, while lunar module pilot Duke assisted with navigation. This was a division of responsibilities used consistently throughout Apollo's J missions. The day's next task was to deploy the ALSEP. While they were parking the lunar rover, on which the TV camera was mounted, to observe the deployment, the rear steering began functioning. About 4 hours after the beginning of EVA 1, they mounted the lunar rover and drove to the first geologic stop, Plum Crater, a 118 feet wide crater on the rim of Flag Crater, about 240 meters across. It was there that Duke retrieved, at the request of Mission Control, the largest rock returned by an Apollo mission, a breccia nicknamed Big Muley after mission geology principal investigator William R. Muehlberger. The next stop of the day was Buster Crater, a small crater located north of the larger Spook Crater, about 1.6 kilometers from the LM. There, Duke took pictures of Stone Mountain and South Ray Crater, while Young deployed the LPM. By this point, scientists were beginning to reconsider their pre-mission hypothesis that Descartes had been the setting of ancient volcanic activity, as the two astronauts had yet to find any volcanic material. Following their stop at Buster, Young did a Grand Prix demonstration drive of the lunar rover, which Duke filmed with a 16mm movie camera. They re-entered the LM 7 hours, 6 minutes, and 56 seconds after the start of the EVA. Once inside, they pressurized the LM cabin, went through a half-hour debriefing with scientists in Mission Control, and configured the cabin for the sleep period. The second lunar excursion's primary objective was to visit Stone Mountain to climb up the slope of about 20 degrees to reach a cluster of 5 craters known as Cinco craters. They drove there in the LRV, traveling 3.8 kilometers from the LM. At 152 meters above the valley floor, the pair were at the highest elevation above the LM of any Apollo mission. They marveled at the view from the side of Stone Mountain, which Duke described as spectacular, then gathered samples in the vicinity. After spending 54 minutes on the slope, they climbed aboard the lunar rover en route to the day's second stop, dubbed Station 5, a crater 20 meters across. 25 minutes after departing the vacant lot, they arrived at the final stop of the day, halfway between the ALSEP site and the LM. There, they dug a double core and conducted several pentrometer tests along a line stretching 50 meters east of the ALSEP. At the request of Young and Duke, the moonwalk was extended by 10 minutes. After returning to the LM to wrap up the second lunar excursion, they climbed back inside the landing craft's cabin, sealing and pressurizing the interior after 7 hours, 23 minutes, and 26 seconds of EVA time, breaking a record that had been set on Apollo 15. After eating a meal and proceeding with a debriefing on the day's activities with Mission Control, they reconfigured the LM cabin and prepared for the sleep period. Flight Day 7 was their third and final day on the lunar surface, returning to orbit to rejoin Mattingly in the CSM following the day's moonwalk. During the third and final lunar excursion, they were to explore North Ray Crater, the largest of any of the craters any Apollo expedition had visited. The drive was smoother than that of the previous day, as the craters were shallower and boulders were less abundant north of the immediate landing site. After passing Palmetto Crater, boulders gradually became larger and more abundant as they approached North Ray in the lunar rover. On the way, they set a lunar speed record, traveling at an estimated 17.1 kilometers per hour downhill. Young drove the rover to a point about 90 meters east of the LM, known as the VIP site, so its television camera, controlled remotely by Mission Control, could observe Apollo 16's liftoff from the moon. After pressurizing the LM cabin, the crew began preparing to return to lunar orbit. The SM carried a suite of scientific instruments in its sim bay, similar to those carried on Apollo 15. Mattingly had compiled a busy schedule operating the various sim bay instruments, one that became even busier once Houston decided to bring Apollo 16 home a day early, as the flight directors sought to make up for lost time. The mass spectrometer boom did not fully retract following its initial extension, as had happened on Apollo 15, though it retracted far enough to allow the SPS engine to be fired safely when Casper maneuvered away from Orion before the LM began its moon landing attempt. Scientists had hoped to supplement the lunar data gained with more on the trans-Earth coast, but Apollo 15 data could be used instead. The mapping camera also did not function perfectly. Later analysis found it to have problems with its glare shield. The changes to the flight plan meant that some areas of the lunar surface that were supposed to be photographed could not be. Also, a number of images were overexposed. 8 minutes before the planned departure from the lunar surface, Capcom James Irwin notified Young and Duke from Mission Control that they were go for liftoff. 6 minutes after liftoff, at a speed of about 5,000 kilometers per hour, Young and Duke reached lunar orbit.